15.
Well, on first being invited to come and talk about happiness, I thought I would give you a lecture on Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics. But then I bethought myself that you would all have been reading it in the bath last night anyway, so you're very familiar with it. You may be a little less familiar with a much more accessible, more popular work, actually, because it was written as a potboiler by Bertrand Russell, a book called The Conquest of Happiness. And the recipe that Russell gives in this book is a very simple, but like some simple things, at any rate, a very profound piece of advice about happiness. And before I tell you what it is, I want to illustrate the truth of what Russell says about it by means of a little story. And the story is about going to China when I was a young man, so 30 or so years ago. I went in the academic year of 1983-1984 to teach in China. And it was a sort of spur-of-the-moment thing. Somebody I knew had gone, and I was going to go and join her there. And so I went along to the Chinese embassy, and I volunteered to go as a teacher in China. And they accepted this offer. And right up to the moment that I was going to set off to China, I was so busy. I was finishing a book and doing a lot of teaching, and there were lots of other things. So I had very little opportunity to prepare mentally or in any other way for going to China, except for two things. One was that I read somewhere that you really had to make sure that you saw your dentist before you went to China, because there were no good dentists in the country. So I did that. I went and saw a dentist, and lots of work done, new fillings and so forth. And the second thing I did by way of preparation was I'd learned that the time difference between London and Beijing was 8 hours. So I thought I would go to bed an hour earlier every day for 8 days before I flew to China, so that when I arrived, I would hit the ground running. I wouldn't have any jet lag, not being very good at jet lag. So I did this. I went to bed an hour early every day. And on the day that I turned up at Heathrow to get my flight, they told me it had gone the day before. So I'd missed the plane. Had to go into London and buy another very, very cheap ticket at a bucket shop on Aeroflot, which I don't know if you've ever flown on Aeroflot, but it's manned by these large female sumo wrestlers with moustaches who don't like to feed people on the aeroplane. Flew to Moscow. I had a long layover in Moscow and then on to Beijing. So by the time I got there, I was sort of trebly jet-lagged, having tried to avoid being jet-lagged. And it's a very important fact, because I arrived in early December, and if you've been in China in winter, you'll know how incredibly cold it gets. It was about 12 degrees below freezing, and it's a very, very dry cold. It's not a damp cold that you get here. And one result of it is, apart from the terrible shock of the cold when you step out of the plane, is that everything gives you a shock. You get static electricity. You get shocks from everything that you touch, people and banisters and your own luggage when you finally pick it up in the airport. So I was frozen, absolutely solid, doubly jet-lagged, getting shocks from everything, and presented, when I got into the town centre, by this extraordinary, surreal experience of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very, very slow-moving cyclists going down the main road. And then equally slowly, a completely silent lorry, because its engine was off to save petrol. It was passing by like this. And to begin with, of course, I didn't realize that people were cycling very slowly because they hadn't had enough to eat and it was very cold and the lorry was saving petrol. I just thought I'd gone mad because everything was going past very, very slowly. So this surreal feeling and terrible jet lag and awful cold. And so I hastened to the restaurant in the hotel that I was staying in to have something to eat. And the very first bite on a jiaozi, which is a little dumpling that the Chinese have, this enormous filling fell out. This was the result of the dentist that I'd been to visit before I went. So I stumbled back to my room in agony, actually, because the terribly cold air was sort of like Dustin Hoffman in The Marathon Man. Every time I opened my mouth to breathe, I've got this shock of the deep hole in my tooth. And I phoned up the British Embassy in Beijing and I asked them for the name of a dentist. And they said, oh, well, we all go to the dentist in Hong Kong. But it was impossible for me to do that because I didn't have enough money. So I asked the hotel if they knew a dentist, and they said, yes, they did. His name was Wang, Dr. Wang. And I looked that up in the telephone directory. Now, there are about 15 million people in Beijing, and most of them are called Dr. Wang, it turned out. So I managed to identify about 24 promising-looking dentist-type Dr. Wangs, and I went in search of them. And most of them had their surgeries in a little shed at the bottom of the garden with an old, rusty dental chair and some rather anxiety-provoking instruments on a wooden table next to it. But I did eventually find a hospital where this Dr. Wang was present, but it was closed. It was half day at the hospital. And when I got to the gate, I could see all the staff, all the nurses and doctors were all holding hands and dancing around a fountain in the middle of the courtyard at the hospital, which didn't provoke much confidence. But I rattled the gates of the hospital and demanded to be let in. And they were very curious, of course, because here was a Waiguoren, you know, a foreigner. And I was pointing at my tooth and making sort of pained faces to add to the ones that we saw on the screen earlier. So they let me in. I found Dr. Wang, and I pointed in my mouth, and he looked in, and he said, he could see what the problem was. And he called to his assistant, who appeared from behind a screen with an enormous syringe. It was quite literally about this big. It looked more like one of those fly sprays that you get in the old days. Because I'd heard the word Novocaine in amongst a sort of Chinese speech that he had made. And I had said, yes, Novocaine, which is when he had called this lady with the big syringe. And I thought that, well, that's reasonably promising, even though it's so big. But then she started to roll up my sleeve. And I wasn't going to have intravenous Novocaine, because I'd never heard that you did have intravenous Novocaine. So I tried to get out of the dental chair, and it's terribly difficult to do it when you're lying more or less, you know, horizontal on your back in a dental chair with a dentist looming over you and a big light and everything. And they were roaring with laughter. It turned out that they weren't going to do intravenous Novocaine. They were just going to drop a little bit of it on my wrist to see if I was allergic to it. Well, not only was I not allergic to it, but it didn't have any effect on me at all. So I was drilled by this Chinese doctor without any anesthetic. It was absolutely agonizing. I kept on squealing and drumming my heels on the chair. And the more I did that, the more firmly he kept my head in a kind of lock like this. And he just kept on doing it. Put the filling in. And you know how it is that when you've been tortured by a dentist or by anybody indeed, when the torture stops, your sentiment is that you want to love them, you know, to throw your arms around them and kiss them. And I kissed Dr. Wang after he had done my filling. And such was the euphoria that followed this terrible experience that as I went back to my hotel afterwards, I thought that I now realized that the very slow-moving bicycles were full of grace and elegance as they went, and the quiet lorries, I thought that's a great improvement on traffic in London, the quietness of the traffic, because they were all rolling downhill with their engines off. And then I got back to the dining room. It happens, by the way, that in this dining room in this hotel, it was quite a frequent occurrence to see the waiters chasing rats around the side of the wall. And I was even rather cheered up by that, because, you know, you had entertainment and wildlife and so on as you had your lunch. And this experience of going to the dentist, after all, it utterly transformed my picture of China. And for the rest of the year that I spent then, it was the first year of a long, long association with China, because I went very often, visited and traveled all around China. I ended up writing a couple of books about it, one with a Chinese colleague and one with my then partner, and became fascinated by so many aspects of this really rather remarkable country. I came to love, for example, its poetry, the great poets of the Tang dynasty, and the classic novels of China, which give such a wonderful insight into the mentalité of the Chinese. The beautiful porcelains, the Song dynasty monochromes, for example, beautiful architecture, and the great variety of the country. As you travel around China, it's an enormous country, from the jungles of the southwest all the way up to the deserts of Xinjiang and up into Mongolia. It's a most extraordinary and varied country, and the people, apart from the party officials and the government and so on, who are a quite different story. But the ordinary Chinese folk whom you meet are really rather lovely. They're very similar in many ways in their sense of humor to us. They're very welcoming. And I fell in love with the country and its culture and enjoyed it. And found that having had very few, if indeed any, expectations before I went, and having had this rather surreal and in some ways unpleasant introduction to the country because of the circumstances in which I arrived, everything that presented itself to me in the country, everything I encountered was a source of immense pleasure and joy. And I tell you this because it illustrates this simple and rather profound insight that Bertrand Russell offers in that potboiler of his, The Conquest of Happiness. He said in it, and here I think he had in mind a remark that John Ruskin had made. Ruskin said, "A person wrapped up in himself makes a very small parcel." Russell's nostrum for happiness was to say, if you are outward looking, if you are engaged and responsive, if you are learning constantly about the world around you and other people, the history, the culture, the ideas, the desires and interests of the great variety of human experience around you. If you are in a place which is constantly offering you fresh new insights and new challenges, if you are, whether in fact, in reality, in space, or in your intellectual life and your emotional life, somewhere very, very new, somewhere unexpected, somewhere where you're invited to make sense of things which are really novel, then you are constantly alive, you're constantly alert and aware. And to be alert to and aware of things which are outside yourself, not dwelling just on your own problems and anxieties and the insults that people have offered you and the resentments that you bear against them and so on. But if instead you are confronted with this great invitation, which is the world around one, as if you were in a new country, as I was in China, so you are constantly alive, and you discover when you reflect on it and think back on it that you were constantly happy. Because happiness is an epiphenomenon. It's something that comes as a property, a characteristic of series of experiences and events where you're not thinking about happiness. It's been very well said that the surefire way to be unhappy is to pursue happiness. Happiness is the thing which is like that little dot of light in a very dark room. When you look at it, you can't see it. But when you look away, you see it in the corner of your eye. Well, happiness is very much a corner of the eye kind of thing. And it attaches itself to the life lived with some vigor, with some energy, with a great deal of interest, and with a great deal of responsiveness to what is outside oneself. So I recommend to you this very simple seeming, but in its way very deep insight that Russell grasped and offered in that book, which is to be outwardly engaged with the world and with other people. To some extent, self-forgetful, especially about one's own woes and anxieties and resentments, because to dwell on those is very toxic. So I just recommend to you the world around you. All the world around us is a China visited for the first time. Thank you.